Welcome to Gina Lento's Session 5 video presentation on corporate greed. Let's first have a look at what was different about corporate greed in the 21st century. Then we'll see what current financial practices are sailing a little bit close to the wind. It's interesting to look at the national debt in this context and ask if it is really any different from the smoke and mirrors game of, say, Enron. And then we would be not good candidate leaders without attempting some forethought about what could be the next global financial crisis and how to prevent it. So here are some of the household names of the biggest corporate scandals in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. Enron was originally an oil and gas company turned energy futures traders, and they were the darling of Wall Street until it came to light that the company had actually been on the brink of bankruptcy for a decade. Global Crossing was another one of those players in the inflated earnings game using futures swaps. WorldCom was a telecom company that went bankrupt after fraudulent practices. Countrywide was one of the banks that was lending predatory loans in the subprime scandal. Bear Stearns was one of those banks that bought a bunch of those packaged loans. Fruit of the Loom and West Point Stevens were two of the largest cotton clothing textile manufacturers, and they were both publicly shamed and bankrupt in the late 90s for a combination of massive debt, tax evasion, and deplorable treatment of employees in foreign countries. And then, of course, Milken, the junk bond king, and Bernie Madoff, who pulled off the biggest Ponzi scheme, losing people $65 billion. Now, in looking at just two of these cases, Lorenz attributes the massive scale of these financial failures to the lack of, or the reduction of, proper control of either civic processes or ignoring cultural norms. But I think that this thought can be generalized to other cases as well. If we look at another two cases, the Enron and the subprime mortgage scandals, we see that they share elements in common and, in fact, lack of sufficient regulatory controls, a relaxation of industry norms, departures from cultural standards of truth in reporting, things like that were at the core of their corporate deceit. They were also both aided in their practices by complicit banks who either didn't question incomprehensible financial reporting or, in fact, created adaptive banking practices to accommodate the very high-risk exotic financial assets that these two companies were trading. Comparing the leaders of these fantastic failures, it's easy to see how their behavior roundly contradicts the approach to authentic leadership described by Northouse. Following George's model, Northouse listed 5 basic characteristics of authentic leadership. Authentic leaders have to have a strong sense of purpose, strong values about the right thing to do. They have to build and maintain trusting relationships with others. They act with self-discipline in alignment with those values, and they have an intact moral compass that allows them to always be mindful of the situations of others. Obfuscating accounting practices and increasingly complex exotic financial products do not indicate a clear sense of purpose, other than greed, which is not a strong value about what is the right thing to do, or trusting relationships with others. They didn't build those either. Continually overflating company value does not show self-discipline, and predatory lending can hardly be described as empathetic to borrowers. So in light of these egregious scandals, the Congress passed a couple of acts. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 was for stricter oversight in corporate accounting and much heavier penalties for infractions. And then the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010, which among other things established the Consumer Financial Credit Bureau, Protection Bureau. Now, 15 years on, the consensus is that Sarbanes-Oxley has largely achieved its goals. But 10 years into Dodd-Frank, what has been seen as a success is now threatened by moves to relax the regulatory requirements for some banks. But scandals of different types continue to emerge, reflecting on the lethal safety failures and environmental pollution cover-ups of these airline and automotive companies. One economic scholar was led to question whether justice can ever really keep up with corporate sin. Looking at some of the modern dodgy practices of a strictly financial nature, it would be imprudent to ignore the potential dangers posed by spoofing, aka flash crashes, and the use of cryptocurrency. Now, spoofing is the practice of traders placing orders for commodities or securities that they have no intention to execute. The purpose is to deceive other traders as to the true demand and supply, which in turn affects pricing moves. The spoofers then leverage those moves for further financial gain. Cryptocurrency is defined as any virtual representation of value that can be used as a form of currency. The special thing about cryptocurrency is that its transactions are supposed to be encrypted, the famous blockchain record of trades, to make it secure. Now, cryptocurrency takes the evolution of currency one step further. Originally we started with barter trading, the barter system. Graduating from that, the world began commonly using commodity-based currency, such as gold. But because larger and larger amounts of heavy gold were not easy to convey or transport, we switched to fiat currency in the form of paper bills and a few coins to convey value. The physical bills themselves have no intrinsic value. They only have value because the world agrees to give it a representative value for tradable goods and services. Cryptocurrency takes that one step further in that there's not even any tangible item that is traded. It's all just strings of zeros and ones on computers that keep track of trades. So an important thing to note about cryptocurrency is that, like the novel financial instruments used by Enron and the subprime mortgage traders, there is only a rudimentary incipient regulation for cryptocurrency to date. And there's considerable debate as to whether which federal regulators should control the trades in cryptocurrency. There's a scholar at Notre Dame who has done a big review of spoofing and cryptocurrency. And this review warns of the potential issues that both could lead to global financial disaster. And he prescribed a 7-point list of recommendations to prevent it, but we'll have to see if that is taken heed of. So that brings us to a quick look at the concept behind the national debt. One could argue that the national debt is not different than cryptocurrency, except that the national debt is negotiated in US dollars, for which a value is set and regulations exist to control it. Now, the way the national debt works is the US Treasury issues IOUs in the form of T-bills, treasury bonds, and other securities, and the Federal Reserve Bank, among others, including foreign central banks, agree to purchase those securities, and they give money to the Treasury to spend. Now, it's effectively taking money from one federal pocket and putting it in another. But then, when it's time to pay off the debt, the U.S. Treasury literally just prints the money and gives it back to the Fed to cancel the debt. Now, how fundamentally different is this practice from Enron's fabricated earnings? The obvious difference is that the Fed and the Treasury are working for the greater good, for the smooth financial operations and the benefit of the entire country. But I'm sure you'll find some that debate this point. So what might be the next global financial crisis? Well, in 2018, one J.P. Morgan trader predicted the passive investment and algorithmic trading, known commonly as rapid machine trading, will be the root of the next crisis. In 2019, a prominent member of the British Board of Governors for the Central Bank of England said the world was sleepwalking into the next crisis by failing to address known weaknesses in the global financial system And many continue to reflect on the fact that very few corporate leaders that perpetrated these scandals have been held accountable for their roles in them. But these predictions, of course, were all made prior to the COVID-19 global pandemic. And while infectious disease experts have suggested for years that the potential existence or creation of novel infectious agents could cause a global pandemic, the world certainly did not conceive of nor prepare for what has occurred in 2020 and the economic impact of it. So it might be best to prepare for the unknowable future by starting with ensuring a widespread return to the approaches and practices of authentic and servant leadership. The development of authentic leadership, with its 5 basic principles noted earlier, has taken off largely in the aftermath of these scandals. But servant leadership is a practice that has been advocated since the time of Christ. Some notable tenets of servant leadership are putting others first and helping followers to grow and succeed, behaving ethically, empowering others, and creating community. These fundamental starting points should be the fundamental starting points for anyone considering not only a leadership position, but also anyone wishing to remain a contributing member of a functional society. God intended for us to be in community with each other. Perpetual stewardship of the community and well-being of its members must remain of primary concern to all of us. By definition, there is a difference between the roles of leader and follower, but that difference should not constitute a detrimental inequity. Vigilance to these ideas ensures a firm grounding in the communal and operational fundamentals of democracy, civility, and truth. From this foundation, other leadership practices that we have learned about facilitate collaborative practices and egalitarian empowerment, and can be developed as needed to make ethical decision-making. In this way, ethical decision-making should become the standard. And with this set of skills, the leaders that be have the best chance of foreseeing and preparing for the next crisis, whatever that may be. And with that, I thank you for the privilege of your time.